48 years ago, a young woman in Waco, Texas vanished after finishing her late shift at a textile mill, leaving behind only her yellow Chevrolet Nova, driver's door hanging open near the Bosque Bridge, and a cold, untouched Coca-Cola on the passenger seat. Authorities dismissed it as a voluntary disappearance, citing no signs of struggle, and the file was sealed within weeks. Her mother refused to believe it, spending decades waiting by a window that overlooked an empty dirt road, whispering her daughter's name into the dark. Then, in 2022, when a cold case investigator discovered a forgotten evidence box in a basement storage room, he found something authorities had missed half a century earlier, a single photograph that would unravel everything, a photograph taken before police arrived at the scene. Before we reveal who was in that photo, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're drawn to cases where justice refuses to die, hit subscribe. Because some truths don't fade, they just wait to be heard. Waco, Texas, August 1974. The evening air pressed down heavy with heat, thick and unmoving. The Bosque River carried the sour smell of mud and rain-soaked grass through the quiet neighborhoods west of downtown. On South 8th Street, dim streetlights flickered over closed storefronts, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. Anna Rudson, 20 years old, folded the last spool of patterned cotton at Bright Textile Mill. She wiped her hands on her apron, humming softly, a melody her coworkers never recognized but would remember for the rest of their lives. She clocked out at 8:03 p.m., said goodnight to the floor manager, and walked into the cooling darkness where her yellow Chevrolet Nova waited, paint faded slightly by the relentless Texas sun. The attendant at the Gulf station on Route 84 would later tell police he remembered her clearly. She bought a Coca-Cola, smiled politely, and mentioned she was heading home for dinner with her mother. The Nova's taillights disappeared west along Highway 84, fading into the haze where farmland met the river. That was the last confirmed sighting of Anna Rudson alive. By 11:45 that night, the Rudson kitchen table sat untouched, meatloaf gone cold, green beans congealing in butter. The porch light burned alone against the dark. Martha Rudson stood at the gate, listening for the distant hum of an engine that never came. She called her daughter's name into the emptiness, hearing only the cicadas' rhythmic drone beneath the trees. By dawn, when Anna's bed remained perfectly made and her shoes still lined up beneath the dresser, panic settled into Martha's chest like a stone. At 5:47 a.m., she lifted the phone with trembling hands and dialed the Bell County Sheriff's Office. Her voice cracked between shallow breaths. "My daughter didn't come home. She wouldn't just leave. Something's wrong." The dispatcher logged the call, marking the beginning of a disappearance that would haunt Waco for nearly half a century, and the start of an investigation that would fail spectacularly. Sheriff Wallace Ford arrived before the mist had lifted from the roads. Coffee still steaming in his hand, he drove the dirt path to the Rudson house, a small structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by overgrown grass that hadn't been cut in weeks. The front door stood slightly open. Inside, Martha sat rigid in the living room, her daughter's graduation photo clutched between her hands. Anna smiled from the frame, brown hair catching sunlight, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. Martha no longer cried. She simply looked up when Ford entered, her voice hoarse and flat. "She never left without telling me. Never." Ford nodded, his tired eyes showing the weight of 2 decades on the job. He asked careful questions, Anna's routine, her car, what she'd been wearing. He borrowed the graduation photo, sliding it into a manila envelope, and promised to do everything in his power to bring him home. It was a promise he wound not keep, but promises made in small-town Texas in 1974 were easy to break. Especially when the evidence was barely there, the resources were thin, and the official story was simpler than the truth. Sheriff Wallace Ford returned to his office that morning with Anna's graduation photo pinned to a corkboard above his desk. He stared at it while his deputy, a young man named Clayton Hayes, poured burnt coffee into chipped mugs. Ford had worked missing persons cases before. Runaways mostly. Teenagers fleeing bad homes or chasing dreams in bigger cities. They usually turned up within a week, sheepish and broke. This one felt different, but different didn't mean urgent in a department stretched thin across 3 counties. Ford's initial report, typed on a manual Underwood with fading ribbon, was methodical but unremarkable. He documented the abandoned Nova, the untouched Coca-Cola, the 2 sets of footprints in the mud near the bridge, one small, likely female, the other larger, deeper, suggesting someone heavier. He noted the keys left in the ignition, the driver's door hanging open at an odd angle, and the absence of Anna's purse, which Martha insisted her daughter always carried. But the report also noted what wasn't there. No blood, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no screaming witnessed by nearby residents. The car wasn't damaged. The surrounding area showed no evidence of violence. By the 4th paragraph, Ford had already begun hedging. Subject may have left vehicle voluntarily. Possible personal reasons unknown to family. It was the language of assumption, not investigation. Deputy Hayes drove back to the Bosque Bridge that afternoon with a Polaroid camera borrowed from the evidence locker. The film was cheap, the focus unreliable, but it was all they had. He photographed the Nova from multiple angles. Driver's side, passenger's side, the open door, the interior with its cold Coca-Cola can sitting upright on the vinyl seat. He photographed the footprints, though by then they'd been trampled by curiosity seekers who'd heard about the discovery on the morning radio broadcast. When Hayes returned to the station, he labeled the photos in ballpoint pen. Rudson vehicle, 8/21/74, Bosque Bridge. Then he slid them into a manila envelope and placed them in Ford's desk drawer. No fingerprint analysis, no soil samples, no attempt to cast the footprints before they were destroyed. In 1974, Bell County didn't have a forensics lab. They didn't have trained crime scene technicians. They had 2 overworked officers, a part-time dispatcher, and a budget that barely covered gasoline. Ford made calls. He contacted the highway patrol, asking if anyone had reported picking up a young woman matching Anna's description along Route 84. He spoke with the manager at Bright Textile, who confirmed Anna had clocked out on time and seemed her usual self. Quiet, polite, humming under her breath as she folded fabric. He interviewed the Gulf station attendant, who remembered her smile and the way she'd said, "Heading home for dinner with Mama," before driving off into the dusk. Every lead pointed to normalcy. Every witness described a woman with no apparent distress, no visible fear, no indication she was about to vanish. And so the official narrative began to take shape, not through evidence but through absence. The absence of anything definitive, anything violent, anything that demanded urgency. By the end of the first week, Ford typed a single-line conclusion at the bottom of his supplemental report. No evidence of foul play at this time. Investigation ongoing. But ongoing in a small-town sheriff's office often meant waiting for something else to happen. The townsfolk filled the silence with their own theories. At Morrison's Diner on Main Street, where the morning regulars gathered over eggs and grits, Anna Rudson became a topic of speculation. Some spoke with concerns, others spoke with thinly veiled judgment. Maybe she had a boyfriend her mama didn't know about, said Dolores Finch, a woman who'd lived in Waco her entire life and believed she knew everyone's business. Girls that age, they get ideas. They run off. I heard she was seen talking to a hitchhiker outside the mill last month, added Eugene Polk, a retired machinist who spent his afternoons listening to police scanners. Could have been planning it for weeks. Her mama's always been a bit particular, someone else murmured, lowering their voice. Maybe Anna wanted out. Martha heard the whispers. She felt them like needles every time she walked into town to buy groceries or pick up her mail. People who'd known her for years now looked at her with pity, mixed with suspicion, as if grief had made her delusional, as if a mother's certainty was just another form of denial. She stopped going to Morrison's Diner. She stopped attending Sunday service at First Baptist. She stayed home, writing letters. Letters to the Waco Tribune-Herald. Letters to the Dallas Morning News. Letters to the Texas Rangers. To the governor's office, to anyone she thought might listen. Her handwriting, once neat and controlled, grew shaky and desperate. My daughter did not run away. She would never leave without telling me. Something happened to her that night, and no one is looking. Most letters went unanswered. A few prompted form responses, polite acknowledgments that offered no action. One editor at the Tribune called her personally, voice sympathetic but firm. "Mrs. Rudson, without new evidence, there's not much we can print. We can't accuse anyone of anything." "I'm not accusing anyone," Martha said quietly. "I'm asking someone to care." But caring required resources. It required manpower. It required belief. And in 1974 Waco, none of those things were abundant for a case already labeled a probable runaway. False leads trickled in sporadically, each one briefly reigniting hope before fizzling into nothing. A truck driver called the sheriff's office claiming he'd picked up a young woman hitchhiking near Hillsboro, about 30 miles north of Waco, 2 days after Anna disappeared. She'd had brown hair, he said, wore a blue dress, didn't say much. Ford drove to Hillsboro with Anna's photo. The truck driver studied it under the fluorescent lights of a gas station and shrugged. Could be her. Hard to say. It was dark. It wasn't her. 3 weeks later, a woman in Dallas reported seeing someone who looked like Anna, working at a diner in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. Ford sent Hayes to investigate. The woman turned out to be 34 years old with a passing resemblance, but a completely different life. Married, 2 kids, hadn't left Dallas in 5 years. Each false lead 8 hours. Each dead end deepened the bureaucratic fatigue. By October, Ford's follow-up reports grew shorter, less detailed. The phrases became repetitive. No new developments. Awaiting additional information. Case remains open but inactive. The word inactive was a bureaucratic euphemism. It meant the case was dying. And in November 1974, it was officially classified as a voluntary disappearance, a designation that required no further investigation unless new evidence emerged. The file was marked accordingly, the few pieces of physical evidence were boxed, and Anna Rudson became a statistic, one of thousands of young adults who went missing each year in America, most of whom were presumed to have left of their own accord. Ford placed Anna's graduation photo in the box. He added the Polaroids Hayes had taken, the gas station receipt, the brief witness statements. He sealed it with packing tape and wrote on the side in thick black marker, 74 Rudson, missing person, voluntary. The box went onto a shelf in the basement storage room, wedged between a 1972 burglary case and a 1975 cattle theft. And that, for all official purposes, was the end. But in Waco, the story didn't quite die. It lingers in the collective memory, especially in the pews of First Baptist Church. Reverend Samuel Brooks, a man in his early 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and a voice that could fill the sanctuary without a microphone, had become the community's spiritual anchor during the uncertainty. He was the kind of pastor people trusted instinctively. Warm handshakes, genuine eye contact, sermons that felt personal rather than performative. When Anna disappeared, Brooks had been among the first to organize search parties. He'd walked the riverbanks with volunteers, carrying a flashlight and a worn leather Bible, stopping occasionally to pray aloud for Anna's safe return. He visited Martha regularly in those early weeks, sitting in her small living room, reading scripture about lost sheep and the shepherd who never stops searching. "Faith doesn't mean understanding, Martha," he'd told her gently, his hand resting on hers. "It means trusting that God sees what we cannot." Martha had drawn comfort from his presence, even as her hope withered. It was Brooks who found the handkerchief. Nearly 2 weeks after Anna vanished while walking near the Bosque Bridge during one of his solitary prayer walks, Brooks discovered a small square of white fabric caught on a branch near the water's edge. He pulled it free carefully, noting the embroidered initials in delicate blue thread. A.R. He brought it to the sheriff's office that same afternoon, handing it to Ford with somber reverence. "I found this near where Anna's car was. I thought it might be important." Ford examined the handkerchief, clean except for some mud along one edge, the stitching clearly personal, likely handmade. He logged it as evidence, adding it to the meager collection in Anna's case file. "Appreciate you bringing this in, Reverend," Ford said, shaking Brooks's hand. "We'll keep it with the rest." Brooks nodded, his expression grave. "I pray it helps. That girl deserves to be found." The handkerchief was photographed, documented, and placed in a small plastic evidence bag. Then it joined the Polaroids and witness statements in the box. No one thought to test it for fingerprints. No one considered it might carry more than just Anna's initials. Brooks continued his ministry, his reputation only growing. He preached about loss and faith, about trusting God's timing even when the world seemed cruel. His sermons during that period were some of his most powerful, drawing larger crowds and deeper emotional responses. People called him a pillar of the community, a man of genuine compassion. And when the investigation stalled and the case was quietly shelved, Brooks was there at Martha's door again, offering prayers and reassurance that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. "God keeps all accounts," he told her. "Nothing stays hidden forever." Martha nodded, tears running down her face, grateful for his kindness. She had no way of knowing how true his words would eventually prove to be. By the winter of 1974, the Rudson case had faded from daily conversation. Newer scandals emerged: a bank embezzlement, a high school drug bust, the usual small-town dramas that cycled through like seasons. Martha stopped writing letters. She stopped expecting calls from the sheriff. She simply waited. Every night she sat in the same chair by the front window, a blanket across her lap, watching the dirt road as headlights occasionally swept past. She left the porch light on, a beacon for a daughter who would never see it. And in the basement of the Bell County Sheriff's Office, on a metal shelf in a room that smelled of mildew and forgotten paperwork, a cardboard box gathered dust. Inside it, 6 Polaroid photographs, a handwritten report, a gas station receipt, a few witness statements, and a white handkerchief embroidered with the initials AR. The box sat untouched for years, then decades. The ink on the label faded, the tape yellowed and cracked. The evidence inside grew brittle with time. But evidence, unlike memory, doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes, when the waiting is long enough, someone finally comes looking. Time moves differently in small towns. In cities, years blur together in the rush of constant change. Buildings rise and fall. Populations shift. Yesterday's headlines vanish beneath today's noise. But in places like Waco, time settles like sediment, layer upon layer, burying the past without erasing it entirely. What cannot be solved becomes story. What cannot be explained becomes legend. And the Bosque River, winding quietly through farmland and beneath forgotten bridges, remembers everything it swallows. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. Martha Rudson aged in that small house at the end of the dirt road, her hair turning from brown to gray to white, her hands growing gnarled with arthritis, her voice fading to a hoarse whisper. But every evening, without fail, she sat in the same chair by the front window. And every night the porch light stayed on, a single yellow bulb burning against the darkness, visible from the road like a lighthouse on an empty shore. Neighbors noticed. Some found it touching. Others found it unsettling. "She's still waiting," they'd say, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and discomfort. After all these years, Martha rarely left the house anymore. Groceries were delivered by a kind woman from the church. Medical appointments were the only exception, and even then she'd insist on being home before sunset. Just in case Anna came back and found the house dark. The town moved on the way towns do. New families arrived, old ones left. The textile mill closed in 1983, its windows boarded up, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. The Gulf Station was demolished and replaced with a modern convenience store. Highway 84 was repaved twice. But the Bosque Bridge remained, its iron frame rusting slowly, its shadow falling across the same muddy banks where Anna's yellow Nova had been found. And sometimes late at night when the fog rolled thick across the water, People swore they could still feel something wrong about that place. By the 1990s, Anna Rudson had become a ghost story. Teenagers dared each other to drive past the bridge after midnight, windows down, headlights off, listening for sounds that didn't belong. A woman's voice calling for help, the echo of footsteps on gravel, the distant hum of an engine that never arrived. Most heard nothing but crickets and the river's soft gurgle. A few claimed otherwise. That poor Rudson girl, the older generation would say when her name came up, usually at funerals or church potlucks where memories were shared like old photographs. She just vanished, never did find out what happened. The details had softened with time, smoothed by repetition into a simplified narrative. Young woman. Disappeared in the 70s. Car found by the river. No trace after that. The specifics, the handkerchief, the footprints, the Coca-Cola can, were forgotten by most. The faces involved blurred. Even Sheriff Ford, who retired in 1989 and died 3 years later from a heart attack, took his quiet frustrations to the grave without ever speaking publicly about the case again. But the river didn't forget. In 1994, a fisherman casting his line near the Bosque Bridge snagged something unusual in the shallows. A woman's leather shoe, small, water-rotted, its sole nearly disintegrated. He brought it to the police station, wondering aloud if it might be connected to that old missing girl case. A younger officer, someone who'd moved to Waco in the 80s and knew nothing of Anna Rudson, examined the shoe with polite disinterest. There was no way to determine how long it had been in the river. No serial numbers, no identifying marks. It could have belonged to anyone, discarded at any time. He logged it as found property and stored it in a different section of the basement. It was never cross-referenced with the Rudson file. 3 years later, a Boy Scout troop hiking along the riverbank discovered a scrap of faded blue fabric caught in the roots of a willow tree. It was small, no bigger than a handkerchief, worn nearly translucent by water and time. The scoutmaster, an amateur history buff, remembered hearing something about a girl who disappeared wearing blue. He contacted the sheriff's office. This time, a deputy made a note in the cold case log, a dusty binder kept on a shelf behind the front desk. But the fabric wasn't tested. No fibers were analyzed. It joined a drawer of unclaimed items, keys, watches, wallets found along roadsides, objects without context, stories without endings. The river offered its secrets slowly, piece by piece, never enough to form a complete picture. And no one was looking closely enough to connect the fragments. The new millennium arrived with fireworks and Y2K fears that amounted to nothing. Martha Rudson turned 83. She no longer sat by the window every night. Her body wouldn't allow it. But the porch light still burned, tended now by a visiting nurse who came twice a week and understood, without being told, that the light was not negotiable. She's waiting for her daughter, the nurse explained to her replacement in 2003. The one who went missing back in the 70s. Don't ever turn that light off. The new nurse nodded, a young woman barely older than Anna had been when she vanished. She couldn't imagine waiting 30 years for someone to come home, let alone 50. But she respected the ritual, clicking the switch each evening before she left, watching the bulb flicker to life against the gathering dark. In town, Anna's story had become distant enough to romanticize. A local playwright wrote a one-act drama titled The Light on Willow Road, performed at the community theater in 2008. It was received politely, praised for its emotional depth, but the details were fictionalized, wrong names, wrong year, wrong ending. The playwright gave Anna a lover, a secret, a reason to leave. The final scene showed her returning decades later to find her mother's house abandoned, the light finally dark. Martha never saw the play. She wouldn't have recognized her daughter in it anyway. By 2010, even that poor Rudson girl was fading from collective memory. The generation that had known her personally was dying off. The younger residents knew only fragments. Something about a disappearance, something about a bridge, something sad that had happened a long time ago. The Bosque River continued its slow, eternal work, eroding banks, carving channels carrying silt downstream toward the Brazos and eventually the Gulf. It didn't speak, but it held its knowledge the way water holds cold, the way stone holds weight. Beneath its surface, in the mud and roots and slow currents, the truth remained submerged but unrotted, waiting for someone to dredge it up. And in the basement of the Bell County Sheriff's Office, now a modern building with fluorescent lights and digital filing systems, the old storage room remained untouched. Boxes from decades past lined the metal shelves. Cases closed, cases forgotten, cases that had outlived the officers who'd worked them. Some were organized. Most were not. Budget cuts had eliminated the clerk position responsible for archiving, and newer cases took priority over historical curiosity. The box labeled M74 Rudson, missing person, voluntary, sat on the third shelf from the floor, wedged behind a water-damaged file from a 1978 arson and a box of unclaimed evidence from the 1980s. Dust coated its surface. The packing tape had cracked and peeled at the edges. The black marker had faded to a grayish-brown, barely legible in the dim light. Inside, the contents waited as they had for decades. 6 Polaroid photographs curling at the edges, a typed report with ink bleeding through the back of the page, a gas station receipt gone brittle, witness statements on yellowing legal paper, and a small plastic evidence bag containing a white handkerchief embroidered with the initials AR. The box didn't know it was important. Evidence never does. It simply existed, patient and still, in a room where time moved differently, where 1974 was not history, but suspended present, waiting for someone to remember, to care, to look again. Outside, the Bosque River flowed on beneath the bridge where Anna's car had been found, its waters dark and cold, holding secrets in its depths the way the earth holds bones. Time passed. Seasons changed. The town grew and shrank and grew again. Martha Rudson's porch light burned through it all. And the river, silent and eternal, waited. Until one day, almost 50 years later, someone opened the box again. Aaron Mills didn't look like someone who spoke for the dead. At 42, he was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, dark hair graying at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose when he leaned over paperwork. He wore plain button-downs and jeans with scuffed boots, carried a worn leather messenger bag, and drank too much gas station coffee. He could have been a teacher, an accountant, anyone who worked quietly at a desk. But Aaron Mills was an investigator with the Texas Cold Case Review Project, a small state-funded initiative launched in 2019 to revisit unsolved crimes from before the digital era. His job was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Take cases that had been abandoned by time, resources, or apathy, and see if modern forensic technology could finally provide answers. He'd been doing it for 3 years, and in those 3 years, he'd learned that justice didn't have an expiration date. It just required someone willing to dig through decades of dust to find it. Mills arrived at the Bell County Sheriff's Office on a gray March morning in 2022, carrying a tablet and a box of nitrile gloves. The building was newer than most he visited, renovated in the early 2000s with clean lines and efficient lighting, but the basement storage room was a relic of an earlier era. The deputy who escorted him downstairs was young, mid-20s, and clearly uninterested in spending his shift babysitting a cold case investigator. "Most of this stuff hasn't been touched in decades," the deputy said, gesturing vaguely at rows of rusted metal shelves. "We digitized everything from the 90s forward, but the older cases, budget cuts, you know. Nobody's had time." Mills nodded, scanning the room. It smelled of mildew and old paper, the air stale and cool. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, some labeled, others not. A few had collapsed under their own weight, spilling manila folders onto the concrete floor. "Take your time," the deputy added, already backing toward the stairs. "Holler if you need anything. I'll be upstairs." Mills waited until the footsteps faded, then pulled on his gloves and got to work. He'd developed a system over the years. Start with the oldest cases first, the ones most likely to have degraded evidence but also the ones most likely to have been mishandled by pre-DNA era standards. He moved methodically along the shelves, reading faded labels, checking dates, making notes on his tablet. 1971, robbery. 1972, assault. 1973, vandalism. And then, on the third shelf from the floor, wedged behind a water-damaged arson file, 74, Rudson, missing person, voluntary. Mills paused, pulling the box free carefully. Dust cascaded off its surface, catching in the weak overhead light. The packing tape had cracked, peeling away at the corners. The black marker had faded to an ashy gray, but the name was still legible. He set the box on a folding table he'd brought down from his truck and opened it slowly, the brittle tape snapping under his fingers. Inside, the contents were sparse, but meticulously organized, a remnant of someone's long-ago diligence. 6 Polaroid photographs, their colors washed out to sickly yellows and greens, showed a yellow Chevrolet Nova from multiple angles. Driver's door open. Interior visible. A Coca-Cola can on the passenger seat. Footprints in the mud, trampled and indistinct. Mills studied each photo carefully, then set them aside. Beneath the photos, a typed report, its text faded but readable, detailing the discovery of the abandoned vehicle, witness statements, and a brief timeline. The final line caught his attention. No evidence of foul play at this time. Investigation ongoing. But the word voluntary written on the box told a different story. Someone had decided this case wasn't worth pursuing. Mills continued digging. A gas station receipt. A handwritten witness statement from someone named Ruth Caldwell. No, Ruth Rudson, the mother. Her shaky cursive pleading for someone to keep looking. And then, at the bottom of the box, 2 small items sealed in brittle plastic evidence bags. The first was a white handkerchief folded neatly, with delicate blue embroidery visible through the clouded plastic, AR. The second was a single strand of hair, dark brown, sealed in a smaller bag with a faded label, Bosque Bridge, 8/20/74. Mills lifted both bags carefully, holding them up to the light. The handkerchief was remarkably well preserved, protected by the plastic despite the decades. The hair, though fragile, appeared intact. He set them down gently, then pulled out his phone and photographed everything. The box, the contents, the labels, the evidence bags. He worked in silence, his movements precise, almost reverent. When he was finished, he sat back in the folding chair and stared at the handkerchief. A.R. Anna Rudson, 20 years old. Disappeared August 1974. Classified as voluntary. Case closed. Except cases like this were never really closed. They just stopped being someone's priority. Mills had seen it before, in Amarillo, in Beaumont, in a dozen small towns where budget constraints and outdated attitudes had allowed investigations to die quietly. Young women dismissed as runaways. Evidence mishandled or ignored. Families left to grieve without answers. His philosophy had always been simple, almost a mantra. Every box in storage is a voice waiting to be heard. And this box had been silent for 48 years. Mills spent another hour photographing the rest of the file, making notes, checking for anything else that might have been overlooked. When he was satisfied, he carefully repacked everything except the 2 evidence bags. Those he sealed in a new container, a modern evidence kit with tamper-proof seals and climate control. He labeled it with the case number, the date, and his initials, then locked it in the temperature-controlled case he kept in his truck. By the time he drove away from the Bell County Sheriff's Office, the sun had burned through the morning haze, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. But Mills wasn't thinking about the weather. He was thinking about the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin, where he'd send the handkerchief and the hair for DNA extraction and analysis. Modern technology could pull genetic profiles from samples far older and more degraded than these. If there was foreign DNA on that handkerchief, a fingerprint's worth of cells, a trace of sweat, anything, the lab could find it. And if that DNA was in any database, criminal, genealogical, military, they could identify it. It was a long shot. DNA databases in 2022 were more comprehensive than ever, but they weren't omniscient. Millions of people had never been tested, and even if they found a match, there was no guarantee it would lead anywhere meaningful. But Mills had learned not to dismiss long shots. He'd seen cases broken open by less. That night, in his small apartment in Austin, Mills sat at his kitchen table with the Rudson file spread before him. He'd scanned everything, uploaded it to his secure server, and printed copies to study by hand. He traced the timeline with a pen. Anna left work at 8:03 p.m., stopped at the gas station at 8:10 p.m., drove west along Highway 84. Car found the next morning at 7:42 a.m., near the Bosque Bridge. Keys in the ignition, no signs of struggle. 2 sets of footprints, one small, one large. The handkerchief found 2 weeks later by a local pastor. Mills paused, reading that section again. Reverend Samuel Brooks located item near bridge during prayer walk. Delivered to Sheriff's Office 9474, a pastor. Walking alone near the site, finding evidence that had somehow been missed during the initial search. Mills made a note in the margin. Follow up on Brooks. Background check. It might mean nothing. People did find things, especially in small towns where locals felt ownership over tragedies. But something about it nagged at him. He set the report down and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in the sprawl of suburbs and highways, evidence was being processed in a sterile lab. DNA was being extracted, sequenced, analyzed. In a few weeks, he'd have results, and maybe, a name. Mills had worked cold cases long enough to know better than to get emotionally invested. The job required distance, objectivity, a willingness to accept that some questions would never be answered. But every case that landed on his desk had once been someone's everything. A daughter who didn't come home, a mother who waited by the window, a light left burning for 50 years. He thought about Martha Rudson, whoever she was now, if she was still alive, still waiting, still wondering. He thought about the yellow Nova, the unopened Coca-Cola, the embroidered handkerchief with initials stitched in blue thread. And he thought about the Bosque River, flowing quietly beneath that bridge, holding its secrets in the dark. Mills returned to the table and wrote a single line in his notebook, underlining it twice. Something about this one feels personal. The river wasn't done talking. He didn't know yet how right he was. But in a few months, when the DNA results came back with a name no one expected, when the pieces of a 48-year-old puzzle finally began to fit together, Aaron Mills would realize that some rivers don't just hold secrets, they carry confessions, and this one had been waiting half a century to be heard. The first time Aaron Mills saw Reverend Samuel Brooks, it was in a photograph from 1974. The image was tucked into the back of the evidence box, separate from the Polaroids of Anna's car, a faded newspaper clipping from the Waco Tribune-Herald, dated August 28, 1974. The headline read, "Community Rallies in Search for Missing Woman." The photo showed a group of volunteers gathered near the Bosque Bridge, their faces solemn beneath the weight of late summer heat. In the center stood a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple white shirt with rolled sleeves. His dark hair was neat, graying slightly at the temples. He held a Bible in one hand and a flashlight in the other, his expression grave but composed, the face of a leader bearing the community's grief with quiet dignity. The caption beneath identified him. Reverend Samuel Brooks of First Baptist Church leads volunteers in prayer before resuming the search. Mills studied the photograph for a long moment, then set it aside with the others. In 1974, Samuel Brooks had been Waco's most trusted spiritual voice. He'd arrived at First Baptist in 1969, fresh from seminary with a young wife and a reputation for sermons that felt less like lectures and more like conversations with God himself. Within a year, Sunday attendance had doubled. Within 3, the church had added a second service to accommodate the crowds. Brooks had a gift, not just for preaching, but for presence. When he spoke, people listened. When he prayed, they believed. He remembered names, asked about sick relatives, showed up at hospital bedsides without being called. He coached Little League on weekends and organized food drives for families struggling through the oil crisis. People didn't just respect him, They loved him. When Anna Rudson vanished, Brooks had been among the first to mobilize. He organized search parties through the church, coordinating volunteers with military precision. He walked the riverbanks himself, often alone in the early mornings, Bible tucked under his arm, calling Anna's name into the fog. He visited Martha regularly in those awful first weeks, sitting with her in the small living room, reading scripture about hope and perseverance. He held her hands while she wept, his voice steady and sure. God sees what we cannot, Martha. He knows where Anna is, even if we don't. Trust in that. At Anna's memorial service, held without a body, without closure, Brooks delivered a eulogy that left the congregation in tears. He spoke of Anna's gentle spirit, her quiet grace, her devotion to her mother. He spoke of the mystery of God's plan and the promise of resurrection. We may not understand, he'd said from the pulpit, his voice breaking with what seemed like genuine anguish. But we trust. We trust that every lost sheep will someday be found. The recording of that sermon still existed, preserved on a reel-to-reel tape in the church archives. Mills would listen to it later and the words would make his skin crawl. The timeline inconsistencies appeared gradually, like fault lines in bedrock that only become visible under pressure. Mills had pulled every document he could find related to the case, not just the official evidence box, but newspaper archives, church bulletins, witness statements filed away and supplemental reports. He cross-referenced dates and times, building a minute-by-minute reconstruction of August 20th, 1974. Anna clocked out at 8:03 p.m., stopped at the Gulf Station at 8:10 p.m., drove west along Highway 84 toward the Bosque Bridge, and Reverend Samuel Brooks, according to the church secretary's log, had dismissed choir practice abruptly at 7:45 p.m., saying he had urgent pastoral business to attend to. Mills sat back in his chair, staring at the note. Choir practice normally ran until 8:30 p.m. on Tuesday nights. But that particular Tuesday, the night Anna disappeared, Brooks had ended it 45 minutes early. The secretary remembered it clearly when interviewed days later, because several choir members had complained about the disruption. Brooks had left First Baptist at approximately 7:50 p.m. His route home took him west along Highway 84, the same road Anna was driving. Mills felt his pulse quicken. He pulled out a map, tracing the route with his finger. From the church to the Bosque Bridge was 12 minutes. Anna would have passed the bridge around 8:20 p.m., assuming normal traffic. Brooks would have been somewhere along that same stretch of road between 8:00 and 8:15 p.m. It could be coincidence. Small towns had limited roads. People crossed paths. But then Mills found the second photograph. It was one of Deputy Hayes's Polaroids, taken the morning Anna's car was discovered. The shot showed the Nova from a distance, the Bosque Bridge visible in the background, morning mist still clinging to the river. But in the lower right corner, partially out of frame, stood a figure Mills hadn't noticed before. A man in light-colored clothing, hands in his pockets, facing the car. Mills used a magnifying app on his tablet, zooming in until the pixels began to break apart. The figure was too far away to identify clearly, but the build was right. The posture was right. And when Mills checked the timestamp on the Polaroid, 7:42 a.m., logged as the moment of discovery, and compared it to witness statements, something didn't add up. The first 911 call reporting the abandoned vehicle came in at 7:39 a.m. from a volunteer firefighter who'd been driving to work. Sheriff Ford arrived at 7:55 a.m., but someone had been there before Ford. Someone who'd arrived within minutes of the initial discovery. Mills flipped through the witness statements until he found it. A brief note from the firefighter who'd made the call. Saw a man already at the scene when I arrived. Thought it was police. Realized later it wasn't. No name, no follow-up. Mills kept digging. In a supplemental report dated September 4, 1974, he found the entry. Reverend Samuel Brooks delivered handkerchief with initials AR to sheriff's office. Item located during prayer walk near bridge, approximately 50 yards downstream from vehicle location. A prayer walk. 2 weeks after Anna vanished. Mills stared at the dates, the times, the locations, feeling the pieces shift and lock into place like a mechanism he'd been assembling in the dark. And then the call came from Austin. The Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab had been processing the handkerchief and hair sample for 6 weeks. When Mills's phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in May, he already knew the news would change everything. Labs didn't call with negative results. They sent emails. "Mr. Mills, this is Dr. Patricia Navarro from the DPS Crime Lab. I'm calling about case number 74 Rudson." Mills set down his coffee, his hand suddenly unsteady. "Go ahead." "We were able to extract viable DNA from both the handkerchief and the hair sample. The hair is consistent with the victim's maternal line based on genealogical matching, but the handkerchief yielded a secondary profile, male, foreign to the victim." Mills closed his eyes. "And?" "We ran it through CODIS, genealogical databases and state records. We got a hit. Direct match, 99.9987% probability." She paused. Mills could hear papers rustling. "The profile belongs to a Samuel Eugene Brooks, date of birth March 14, 1931. He submitted a DNA sample in 2019 as part of a routine medical screening that was flagged into the state database under voluntary participation protocols." The room tilted slightly. Mills opened his laptop, fingers moving automatically, pulling up Brooks's name in public records. Samuel Eugene Brooks, age 91, retired pastor, resident of Temple, Texas, 30 miles from Waco. The same man who'd comforted Martha Rudson, who'd led search parties, who'd found the handkerchief. The same man whose DNA was now on that handkerchief with a probability that eliminated all reasonable doubt. "Mr. Mills, are you there?" "I'm here," Mills said quietly. "Can you send me the full report?" "It's already in your inbox." "And Mr. Mills? Given the subject's age and the nature of the case, we've flagged this for immediate law enforcement coordination. You'll want to move quickly." Mills thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment, he sat in silence, staring at Brooks's photograph on his screen. A church directory photo from 2015 showing an elderly man with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, smiling gently, the words, "Pastor Emeritus," beneath his name. The news leaked within 72 hours. Mills had contacted the Bell County Sheriff and the District Attorney immediately, both of whom reacted with the same stunned disbelief. Background checks were run. Old case files were pulled. Quietly, carefully, they began building the framework for an arrest warrant. But small towns have thin walls, and law enforcement has long memories. By Sunday, whispers had begun circulating through Waco. Someone high profile, someone from the 70s, someone no one would expect. By Monday, a retired deputy mentioned the name to his brother-in-law. By Tuesday, half the congregation at First Baptist had heard rumors they didn't want to believe. "It can't be Reverend Brooks. He's the one who helped search for her. There must be a mistake. The man's 90 years old, for God's sake. He baptized my children. He married my parents. This is insane." Denial settled over the community like morning fog, thick and obscuring. But Mills had seen denial before. It was the first stage of reckoning. That Friday, Mills sat alone in his apartment, a cardboard box on his desk containing materials he'd requested from First Baptist's archives, old sermon recordings, church bulletins, photographs from the 1970s. Among them was a cassette tape labeled August 25, 1974, sermon, "The Truth Shall Make You Free." Mills loaded it into an old cassette player he'd borrowed and pressed play. The recording crackled to life. Brooks's voice emerged, younger but unmistakable, rich, authoritative, tinged with carefully measured emotion. Scripture tells us in John 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But what is truth, brothers and sisters? Is it what we see? Is it what we believe? Or is it what God knows in the depths of our souls, waiting to be revealed in His time, not ours? Mills listened to the entire sermon, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Brooks spoke about hidden sin, about secrets carried in the heart, about the inevitability of divine judgment. We cannot hide from God, Brooks had said, his voice swelling with conviction. We may hide from each other. We may hide from the law, but we cannot hide from him. And in the end, we will all answer for what we've done. The tape clicked off. Mills sat in the silence, staring at the photograph of Brooks holding his Bible by the bridge, and thought, "You were right, Reverend. We all answer eventually." It just took 50 years. The old witnesses emerged like ghosts from the past, their memories fragile but surprisingly intact. Aaron Mills spent 2 weeks tracking them down, names pulled from 50-year-old reports, obituaries cross-referenced with phone directories, nursing home registries searched with patient determination. Most were dead. Some had moved away decades ago, but a few remained, scattered across central Texas, carrying pieces of a story they'd never fully understood. The first was Eugene Marsh, 87 years old, living in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Waco. He'd been the attendant at the Gulf Station in 1974, the last confirmed person to see Anna Rudson alive. Mills found him on his front porch, a blanket across his lap despite the warm May afternoon, rheumy eyes squinting at the investigator's identification. "I already told the police everything back then," Marsh said, his voice thin and uncertain. "Don't know what else I can say." "I know, Mr. Marsh, I've read your statement. I just want to ask about one detail." Mills sat down uninvited, pulling out the old case file. "You said Anna bought a Coca-Cola at 8:10 p.m. and mentioned heading home for dinner. Do you remember anyone else coming into the station around that time? Anyone following her, maybe?" Marsh was quiet for a long moment, staring past Mills toward the street. "There was a man," he said finally. "Came in maybe 5-10 minutes after she left. Bought cigarettes, I think. Or maybe just asked for directions. Memory's fuzzy." "What did he look like?" "Older than her. 40s maybe. Wore a gray shirt, I remember that. Looked respectable, you know, like a preacher or a teacher. Had that way about him." Mills felt his pulse quicken. "Did he ask about the girl who'd just left?" Marsh's eyes shifted, clouded with uncertainty. "Maybe. Maybe he asked which way she'd gone. I told him west, toward the bridge. Didn't think nothing of it at the time." "Did you tell the police this in 1974? Marsh shook his head slowly. "Nobody asked about another customer. They just wanted to know about the girl." Mills thanked him and left, adding another thread to the web forming in his mind. The second witness was harder to find. Dorothy Keene, 79, had been a volunteer in the initial search parties. Mills located her in a memory care facility in Temple, her mind clear on some days, distant on others. He visited 3 times before catching her on a good morning, when her eyes focused and her voice held steady. "I remember that search," she said, sitting in the common room with a cup of weak tea. "We all thought we'd find her, thought maybe she'd gotten lost, hurt herself. Never imagined—" She trailed off, staring at her hands. Mills leaned forward gently. "Mrs. Keene, do you remember seeing anyone at the bridge the morning Anna's car was found? Before the police arrived?" Dorothy nodded slowly. "There was a blue sedan, parked up on the road, not down by the water. I drove past it on my way to meet the others. Thought maybe it was police, but it was too early. Sun wasn't even up yet." "Did you see who was driving?" "No, but I saw the car again later that day, parked at the church. Recognized it because it had a little cross decal on the back window. Reverend Brooks's car." She looked up at Mills, confusion crossing her face. "Why are you asking about the Reverend? He was the one helping us search." Mills chose his words carefully. "Just following up on some details, ma'am. Thank you for your time." As he left, Dorothy called after him, her voice suddenly sharp. "He was always there, you know. Always the first one at the bridge, before anyone else. I thought it was devotion. Now I wonder—" She didn't finish the sentence. Mills didn't need her to. Back in Austin, Mills compiled everything into a formal report. The DNA evidence, the timeline inconsistencies, the witness statements that hadn't been properly documented in 1974. He included photographs, church records showing Brooks's abrupt departure from choir practice, and the original evidence log showing Brooks had found the handkerchief weeks after the disappearance. The district attorney read it twice, then authorized a search warrant. "We need to move carefully," she said, sliding the signed document across her desk. "This man is 91 years old. He's a retired pastor. The optics are delicate. He's also likely responsible for a murder," Mills replied quietly. "Then let's make sure we get this right." The warrant was executed on a Wednesday morning, just after dawn. Mills accompanied the Bell County Sheriff's deputies to Brooks's home in Temple, a small single-story house with white siding and a neat lawn, the kind of place that looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1985. Wind chimes hung from the porch. A bird feeder swayed gently near the driveway. Brooks answered the door in a cardigan and slippers, his white hair uncombed, confusion clouding his weathered face. "Can I help you, officers?" Sheriff Ramirez held up the warrant. "Reverend Brooks, we have authorization to search your home in connection with an ongoing investigation." Brooks blinked slowly, then stepped aside without protest. "Of course, whatever you need." He sat in his living room while deputies moved through the house methodically, closets, drawers, shelves. Mills watched Brooks carefully, looking for signs of nervousness, but the old man simply sat with his hands folded, expression serene, almost expectant. "You've been waiting for this," Mills said quietly. Brooks looked up, meeting his eyes. "I've been waiting for many things, young man. God's timing is not ours to question." It was Deputy Chen who found it, 2 hours into the search. "Detective Mills, you need to see this." Mills followed her to the basement, a finished space with wood paneling and outdated furniture, the kind of rec room that had been popular in the 70s. In the corner, behind an old console television, sat a cedar chest secured with a simple padlock. They cut the lock. Inside, the chest was organized with unsettling precision. Church bulletins from the 1970s, neatly stacked and labeled by year. A folded topographic map of the Bosque River area, marked with red X's at 3 separate locations. Photographs of young women Mills didn't recognize, their faces smiling and unaware. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a Super 8 film reel in a metal canister, labeled in careful handwriting, "Search 1974. Mills's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. They set up a projector in the Bell County Sheriff's conference room that afternoon. Mills, Sheriff Ramirez, the district attorney, and 2 senior deputies sat in darkness as the reel loaded, the old mechanism clicking and whirring. The film had degraded slightly over the decades, but the images were clear enough. The footage opened on fog, thick, gray, rolling across dark water. The Bosque River at dawn, the light weak and diffused. The camera moved unsteadily, handheld, shaking slightly with each step. Then, the yellow Chevrolet Nova, parked at an angle on the muddy shoulder, driver's door hanging open. The camera approached slowly, the breathing of the person behind it audible, steady, controlled, almost meditative. The lens moved around the car, filming the interior, the work bag on the passenger seat, the keys in the ignition, the unopened Coca-Cola can beaded with condensation, and then the camera turned briefly toward a reflection in the car window. A man's face, younger than Mills had seen in photographs, but unmistakably Samuel Brooks. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. The footage continued. The camera panned down to the mud, where 2 sets of footprints were still visible, one small, one larger. Brooks's breathing grew heavier, catching slightly in his throat. And then, so quietly it was almost missed, a whisper. "Lord, forgive me. Cleanse her sins and wash away her sins." The film ran for another 30 seconds. Fog, water, the sound of breathing, and then clicked to black, the reel spinning empty. The lights came back on. No one spoke. Mills stared at the blank screen, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on the armrests. He'd seen crime scene photos before, autopsy reports, confession videos. But this was different. This wasn't evidence. This was confession, preserved on film for 50 years, hidden in a locked chest like a secret too terrible to destroy but too damning to share. Brooks had recorded himself at the scene. Before police arrived, before anyone knew Anna was missing, he documented his own crime and kept it like a relic. Jesus Christ, one of the deputies breathed. The district attorney was already reaching for her phone. Get an arrest warrant prepared immediately. First-degree murder, and I want him in custody before the end of the day. Sheriff Ramirez nodded, his face grim. We'll bring him in. Mills didn't move. He was still staring at the blank screen, hearing that whisper echoing in his mind. Cleanse her soul. Wash away her sin. Not my sin. Her sin. Brooks had believed he was doing God's work, and that, Mills realized, was somehow more horrifying than anything else. That evening, Mills sat alone in his truck outside the Bell County Sheriff's Office, watching the last light fade from the sky. Inside, Brooks was being processed, fingerprinted, photographed, read his rights. The old man had come quietly, even graciously, as if he'd been expecting this moment for decades. Mills thought about Martha Rudson, now 91 herself, still living in that small house at the end of the dirt road. Someone would have to tell her. Someone would have to explain that the man who'd comforted her, who'd prayed with her, who'd helped search for her daughter, had been the one who'd taken Anna away. He thought about the river, flowing quietly beneath the bridge, holding its secrets for 48 years, and he thought about the film reel, sitting now in an evidence locker, a confession that had waited half a century to be heard. Mills started the engine and pulled onto the highway, heading back toward Austin. Behind him, the Bosque River rolled on in the darkness, finally beginning to give up its dead. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clear, still light that makes everything feel both ordinary and significant at once. At Grace Chapel in Temple, Texas, a modest building with white clapboard siding and a simple wooden cross above the door, parishioners began arriving just before 10 o'clock. They came in their Sunday best, carrying worn Bibles and casserole dishes for the potluck afterward, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a congregation that had worshipped together for years. Inside, the sanctuary was plain but well kept. Wooden pews polished smooth by decades of use, stained glass windows casting colored light across the floor, an upright piano in the corner where Mrs. Henderson had played hymns every Sunday for the past 20 years. It was the kind of church where everyone knew everyone, where babies were baptized and elders were buried, where the rhythm of faith moved slow and steady like a heartbeat. This Sunday would be different. Aaron Mills sat in his truck 3 blocks away, watching the minutes tick past on his dashboard clock. Beside him, Sheriff Ramirez spoke quietly into his radio, coordinating with 2 deputies parked on adjacent streets. "We wait until service starts," Ramirez said, his voice low. "Less disruption that way, fewer people outside." Mills nodded, though his stomach was tight with something between anticipation and dread. He'd been present for arrests before, violent offenders, domestic abusers, white-collar criminals who'd collapsed in tears when the cuffs clicked shut. But this felt different. This was theater. This was symbolism. This was justice walking into the one place Samuel Brooks had always claimed sanctuary. At 10:15 a.m., Ramirez's radio crackled. "We're in position." "Move in 5, Ramirez replied. Mills took a slow breath and stepped out of the truck. Inside Grace Chapel, the service had begun. The congregation rose as Mrs. Henderson played the opening notes of Amazing Grace, the melody swelling through the small sanctuary. Voices joined in, some strong and confident, others wavering but sincere. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. At the front, behind a simple wooden pulpit, stood Reverend Samuel Brooks. At 91, he moved slowly but with dignity, his white hair neatly combed, his suit pressed, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He held his Bible with both hands, open to the passage he'd chosen for today's sermon. His expression was peaceful, almost beatific, as he gazed out at his flock. 37 people who still came to hear him preach, who still believed in his words. He'd stepped down as senior pastor of First Baptist decades ago, but Grace Chapel had welcomed him as a guest preacher, honored to have a man of his reputation and experience in their pulpit. The hymn continued. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Brooks closed his eyes, mouthing the words, his lips moving in silent prayer. And then, very quietly, the back doors of the chapel opened. Mills entered first, followed by Sheriff Ramirez and 2 deputies in plainclothes. They moved slowly down the center aisle, their footsteps muffled by the hymn. A few heads turned, curious glances, mild confusion, but most continued singing, eyes on their hymnals or closed in worship. Mills kept his gaze fixed on Brooks, watching for any sign the old man had noticed them. But Brooks didn't look up. His eyes remained closed, his face serene. The hymn reached its final verse. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. Mills reached the front pew. Ramirez moved to his left, positioning himself near the side aisle. The deputies flanked the exits. The last note hung in the air, then faded. Silence settled over the chapel. Mrs. Henderson's hands lifted from the keys. The congregation sat, the pews creaking softly. A baby fussed somewhere in the back, quickly shushed by its mother. Brooks opened his eyes. He set his Bible down gently on the pulpit, his weathered hand smoothing the pages. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, carrying the practiced resonance of a man who'd preached for 60 years. Let us turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32. He lifted the Bible and read, And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. He paused, looking out at the congregation, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces. Truth, he said softly. It is the foundation upon which all faith must stand. Without truth, we have nothing. Without truth, we are lost in darkness, stumbling toward. Reverend Samuel Brooks. Mills's voice cut through the sanctuary, firm but not shouting. Every head turned. Brooks stopped mid-sentence, his eyes finally finding Mills standing at the front pew. For a moment, something flickered across the old man's face. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. He set the Bible down again very slowly. Yes? Mills stepped forward, his badge held out so the congregation could see. Ramirez moved with him, hand resting near his holster but not threatening. Reverend Samuel Brooks, Mills said, his voice carrying in the sudden absolute silence. You are under arrest for the murder of Anna Marie Rudson. The chapel erupted. Gasps. A woman's sharp cry. Someone in the back shouted, What? No! Voices overlapped in shock and confusion, rising like a wave. But Brooks remained still, standing behind the pulpit, his hands resting on the worn wood. This is a mistake, someone called out. He's a man of God. You can't just... He's 90 years old, for Christ's sake. Ramirez raised his hand, his voice cutting through the chaos. Please remain seated. This is an official police action. Mills kept his eyes on Brooks. Sir, you need to come with us. Brooks didn't move immediately. He looked down at his Bible, still open to John 8:32, then out at his congregation, men and women he'd married, baptized, buried loved ones for. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between sorrow and strange, terrible peace. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying. I did only what God demanded. The chapel fell silent again, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Mills felt something cold settle in his chest. Sir, he repeated, please step down from the pulpit. Brooks nodded slowly. He closed the Bible with care, his fingers tracing the leather cover one last time. Then he descended the 3 steps from the pulpit, moving with the careful deliberation of an old man whose body no longer obeyed him as it once had. When he reached Mills, he held out his wrists without being asked. Ramirez stepped forward with handcuffs, the metal clicking softly in the silence. "You have the right to remain silent," Ramirez began, his voice professional and detached. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The congregation watched in stunned, horrified silence. Some were crying. Others sat frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. As the deputies escorted Brooks down the center aisle toward the doors, he turned his head slightly, speaking to no one in particular, his voice carrying a strange, distant certainty. "The river remembers. I told them where to look. God will judge me justly." Then he was through the doors and into the bright Texas sunlight. Outside, chaos waited. News vans lined the street, cameras already rolling. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. "Reverend Brooks, did you kill Anna Rudson? How long have you known? Do you have anything to say to the family?" Brooks said nothing. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as deputies guided him toward the patrol car. Flashbulbs popped, cameras clicked. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was crying. Mills stood on the chapel steps, watching it unfold. The spectacle, the media frenzy, the collapse of a reputation built over half a century. Sheriff Ramirez joined him, loosening his tie slightly, exhaling hard. "Hell of a Sunday," he muttered. Mills watched as the patrol car pulled away, Brooks visible through the back window, staring straight ahead. "Sometimes," Mills said quietly, "justice walks right into church." Ramirez glanced at him. "Think he'll confess?" "He already has. We just needed to hear it." Behind them, parishioners began filing out of the chapel, their faces pale with shock, their faith shaken in ways that would take years to untangle. Some were angry, some were weeping. Some simply stood in the parking lot, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile the man they'd known with the monster he'd been accused of being. Mills turned away from the cameras and walked back to his truck. There was still work to do. A confession to document, a body to recover, a family to finally, after 48 years, give answers to. But for now, as the sun climbed higher over Temple, Texas, and the news crews scrambled to report the story that would dominate headlines for weeks, Aaron Mills allowed himself one small, grim moment of satisfaction. The river had spoken. The truth was free. And Samuel Brooks, who had spent a lifetime preaching about judgment, would finally face his own. In the patrol car, Brooks sat with his cuffed hands folded in his lap, staring out the window at the passing streets. His lips moved silently, forming words no one could hear. "Forgive me, Father. Cleanse me. Make me whole." But the only answer was the hum of the engine and the quiet static of the radio. And somewhere, deep in the muddy waters of the Bosque River, Anna Rudson's remains waited to come home. The interrogation room at the Bell County Jail was small and colorless. Cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, fluorescent lights humming overhead with the insistent drone of trapped insects. Samuel Brooks sat across from Aaron Mills, his cuffed hands resting on the table, his posture upright despite his age. He'd refused a lawyer, refused water, refused everything except the small leather Bible a deputy had retrieved from his home at his request. For 12 hours, Mills asked questions. For 12 hours, Brooks said almost nothing. "Tell me what happened the night Anna disappeared." Silence. "We have your DNA on her handkerchief. We have you on film at the scene. We have witnesses placing you on that road." Brooks stared at the wall, his expression distant. "Did you know her? Did she know you?" Nothing. Mills leaned forward, exhaustion tightening his voice. "Reverend, I know you recorded that film for a reason. You kept it for 50 years. You wanted someone to find it eventually, so talk to me. Tell me why." Brooks's eyes shifted, finally meeting Mills's. "Where the river splits in two," he said quietly. Mills blinked. "What?" "Where the river splits in two." Brooks repeated the phrase like a mantra, his voice calm, almost liturgical. "Where he washes all sins away." "What does that mean?" Brooks closed his eyes. Only God can judge. Only God knows where the lost are found. And then he fell silent again, lips moving in wordless prayer, retreating into a place Mills couldn't reach. By midnight, the district attorney called it. Let him sit. We've got enough to charge him without a confession. But Mills... She paused, her voice heavy over the phone. If there's any chance he's telling you where the body is, you need to figure out what the hell he means. Mills drove back to his hotel room in Temple, his mind turning the phrase over and over, where the river splits in two. At 2 a.m., he sat at the small desk with his laptop open, surrounded by printed maps and satellite images of the Bosque River. He traced the waterway with his finger, following its path through McLennan County, searching for any point where the river branched or divided. The Bosque was mostly singular, a winding ribbon cutting through farmland and limestone bluffs. But rivers changed. Channels shifted over time. What had been one path in 1974 might look different now. Mills pulled up historical topographic maps from the USGS database, focusing on surveys from the 1970s. He zoomed in on the area west of Waco, near where Anna's car had been found, and there, approximately 3 miles upstream from the Bosque Bridge, he found it. A small notation on a 1973 survey, seasonal split channel, floods during spring runoff. The river divided around a low island, creating 2 parallel channels that rejoined a 1/4 mile downstream. In the dry season, one channel would have been barely a trickle, but in August 1974, after summer rains, both would have been flowing. Mills sat back, staring at the map, where the river splits in two. He called Sheriff Ramirez at 6 a.m. I think I know where she is. The excavation team assembled at dawn. Mills stood on the muddy bank of the Bosque River, watching the sun break through morning fog. Around him, forensic technicians unpacked equipment, ground-penetrating radar, shovels, evidence markers, body bags sealed in plastic. A K-9 unit waited nearby, the cadaver dog panting softly in the cool air. The location was remote, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that hadn't been maintained in decades. Overgrown willows leaned over the water. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, that ancient scent of things returning to soil. Ramirez approached, coffee in hand, his expression grim. If she's here, after 50 years. I know, Mills said quietly. But Brooks knew this place. He described it too specifically to be random. The GPR operator called out from the island's western edge. Got something. Density anomaly approximately 4 feet down. Size and shape consistent with human remains. Mills felt his chest tighten. Mark it. The excavation began slowly, methodically. 2 technicians worked in careful increments, removing layers of clay and silt with small trowels and brushes. Every few minutes they'd stop, photograph the site, take measurements. The process was painstaking, reverent. Mills watched from the perimeter, arms crossed, barely breathing. An hour passed, then 2, and then one of the technicians stopped, her brush hovering over something dark, protruding from the soil. I've got fabric, she said quietly. The team moved in closer. Cameras clicked. The technician worked carefully around the object, exposing more of the material. Rotted, discolored but recognizably textile. Blue, or what had once been blue. There's more, her partner said, working a few feet away. Leather. Looks like a shoe. Mills stepped closer, his throat tight. The excavation continued. Piece by piece, the earth gave up its secrets. A shoe. Woman's, size 6. Leather mostly deteriorated, but the sole intact. A brass button, green with oxidation. Fragments of cloth, blue and faded. And then 3 feet deeper, wrapped in clay like a shroud, bone. The forensic anthropologist knelt in the pit, examining the remains with gloved hands. She worked in silence for several minutes, then looked up at Mills. Human, female, young adult based on bone density and fusion, consistent with the time frame. Mills closed his eyes. "Get dental records," he said hoarsely. "I want confirmation." The forensic confirmation came 36 hours later. Mills was in his office in Austin when the email arrived, the subject line stark and final. Positive ID, Case 74, Rudson. He opened the attachment, a comparison of dental records from Anna Rudson's 1972 checkup with radiographs taken from the recovered remains. The match was unambiguous. 12 distinct points of correlation. No room for doubt. The remains found at the split in the Bosque River belonged to Anna Marie Rudson. Mills printed the report, then sat for a long moment staring at her graduation photo pinned to his corkboard. The girl with the sunflowers. The girl who'd bought a Coca-Cola and smiled at a stranger. The girl who'd been 20 years old and would never be 21. "We found you," he whispered. "You're coming home." Then he picked up his phone to make the call he'd been dreading. Martha Rudson was 91 years old, bedridden now, her body finally giving out after decades of stubborn waiting. Mills drove to her house that afternoon, Sheriff Ramirez accompanying him. The small structure looked even more weathered than the photographs had suggested. Paint peeling, porch sagging, the yard overgrown. But the porch light was on, burning weakly in the daylight. A hospice nurse met them at the door, her expression wary. "She's not well," the nurse said quietly. "I'm not sure she'll understand." "She'll understand," Mills said. Martha lay in a hospital bed that had been moved into the living room, surrounded by photographs. Anna at graduation, Anna as a child, Anna smiling in a dozen different moments frozen in time. The old woman's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Mills knelt beside the bed, taking her hand gently. "Mrs. Rudson, my name is Aaron Mills. I'm an investigator with the state. I need to tell you something about Anna." Martha's eyes opened slowly, roomy and unfocused. Her voice came as a whisper. "My Anna." "Yes, ma'am. We found her. We brought her home." For a long moment Martha didn't respond. Then tears began sliding down her weathered cheeks, silent and steady. "She didn't leave me," Martha whispered. "I knew she didn't leave." "No, ma'am. She didn't leave." Martha's hand tightened weakly around Mills's fingers. Can I see her?" Mills glanced at the nurse, who shook her head almost imperceptibly. "She's at peace now," Mills said gently. "And the person who hurt her is in custody. He'll answer for what he did." Martha closed her eyes again, a small, broken smile crossing her lips. "Turn off the light," she whispered. "She's home. Turn off the light." The nurse moved to the porch, and for the first time in 48 years the bulb went dark. 3 days later, Martha Rudson passed away in her sleep. The obituary was brief, survived by numerous cousins and friends. Preceded in death by her daughter Anna Marie Rudson. Services private. Mills attended the funeral at a small cemetery outside Waco. Fewer than a dozen people stood graveside as Martha was laid to rest beside a new headstone, clean and white. Anna Marie Rudson, 1954, 1974, beloved daughter. Finally home after the service, Mills stood alone at the grave, hands in his pockets, watching clouds move across the sky. Sheriff Ramirez approached quietly. "You did good work." Mills shook his head. "Took 50 years. But it got done." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Ramirez spoke again. "Brooks wants to talk to you. Says he has something to say." Mills turned. "Now he wants to talk?" "Said he'd only speak to you." Mills returned to the Bell County Jail that evening. Brooks sat in the same interrogation room, looking smaller somehow, diminished. His Bible sat closed on the table. Mills sat down without preamble. "We found her, right where you said, where the river splits." Brooks nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I knew you would. Why didn't you just tell us?" Brooks was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, almost dreamlike. "I thought I was saving her. She was lost, living in sin, working in that place, forgetting God. I tried to guide her, to show her the path, but she wouldn't listen. He trailed off. So you killed her, Mills said flatly. I freed her, Brooks whispered. I cleansed her soul and gave her to the river. God's river, where sins are washed away. Mills felt cold spreading through his chest. You're insane. Brooks looked up, his eyes clear and certain. No, I'm faithful. And now she's home. Her mother's at peace. It's finished. Mills stood abruptly, chair scraping against concrete. He couldn't bear to be in that room anymore, couldn't stomach the delusion dressed up as devotion. At the door, he paused. The river didn't wash anything away, Reverend. It just held the evidence until someone was willing to listen. Brooks smiled faintly. Then it served God's purpose after all. Mills left without responding. Outside, the Texas night was warm and heavy. Somewhere to the west, the Bosque River flowed on beneath the stars, finally unburdened of its 50-year secret. Anna Rudson was home, and Samuel Brooks, who had believed himself an instrument of divine will, sat alone in a cell, waiting for a judgment he would never truly understand. The courtroom was packed on the morning of November 14, 2022. Every seat in the Bell County District Court was filled. Family members of the accused, journalists from as far as Dallas and Houston, curious locals who'd grown up hearing whispers about that poor Rudson girl, and law enforcement officers who'd worked the case or simply wanted to witness its conclusion. At the prosecution table, the district attorney arranged her files with practiced precision. Across the aisle, Brooks's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd taken the case reluctantly, sat alone, his client having refused to assist in his own defense. And at the defendant's table, Samuel Brooks sat in an orange jumpsuit, his hands folded, his expression serene. At 91, he looked almost fragile under the fluorescent lights, more grandfather than monster. But the evidence didn't lie. Over 6 days of testimony, the prosecution had presented a case that was both meticulous and damning. DNA evidence placing Brooks at the scene. The Super 8 film showing him at Anna's car before police arrived. Witness statements about his suspicious behavior. Church records documenting his abrupt departure on the night Anna disappeared. And then, on day 4, the bombshell. Investigators had connected Brooks to 2 other cold cases, young women who'd vanished in 1972 and 1976, both members of Baptist churches where Brooks had served as a visiting preacher. Both disappeared after evening services. Both were found years later in remote locations near rivers. The pattern was undeniable. Brooks listened to it all without visible emotion, occasionally closing his eyes as if in prayer, occasionally whispering to himself words no one else could hear. When the prosecution rested, his attorney offered no defense. There was nothing to offer. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Aaron Mills sat in the back row as the verdict was read, watching Brooks's face for any flicker of reaction. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Anna Marie Rudson, we the jury find the defendant Samuel Eugene Brooks guilty. The courtroom erupted, gasps, sobs, a few muted cheers quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Brooks didn't flinch. He simply bowed his head slightly, as if accepting a benediction. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd presided over the case with visible disgust, leaned forward. Mr. Brooks, you have been found guilty of one of the most calculated and cruel acts this court has seen. You used your position of trust, your role as a spiritual leader, to prey upon vulnerable young women. You took a daughter from her mother and spent 50 years walking free while that mother waited in anguish. She paused, her voice hardening. Given your age and health, a life sentence is largely symbolic, but it is a sentence nonetheless. You will spend whatever time you have left in custody, and you will die knowing that your legacy is not one of faith, but of betrayal. Brooks looked up then, meeting the judge's eyes. I accept God's judgment, he said quietly. Not yours. The judge's jaw tightened. Take him away. As deputies led Brooks from the courtroom, he turned once, scanning the crowd. His eyes found Mills and held for a moment. Not defiant, not apologetic, just empty. Then he was gone, disappearing through the side door that led to the holding cells. Mills exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of 8 months of work finally lift from his shoulders. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. News cameras lined the steps, reporters shouting questions at anyone who emerged. Protesters held signs, some calling for the death penalty despite Texas law prohibiting it for defendants over 70, others proclaiming Brooks's innocence with the kind of fervent denial that facts couldn't penetrate. The town was divided, fractured along fault lines of belief and complicity. Some residents expressed shock and horror, claiming they'd never suspected anything. Others felt a deeper, more uncomfortable guilt. The recognition that they'd seen Brooks at the bridge that morning, had accepted his explanations without question, had praised him for his devotion while a killer hid behind a collar. "How did we not see it?" one woman asked a reporter, tears streaming down her face. "He baptized my children. He was at my wedding. How did we not know?" But others clung to doubt. "There's no way," an elderly man insisted to anyone who'd listen. "That DNA evidence is unreliable. They've got the wrong man. Reverend Brooks wouldn't hurt a fly." Mills watched from a distance, leaning against his truck, too tired to engage. Sheriff Ramirez joined him, loosening his tie. "Hell of a thing." "Yeah." "You think he ever felt guilty? Even once?" Mills shook his head. "I think he genuinely believed he was doing God's work. That's what makes it worse." They stood in silence, watching the media circus unfold. "You heading back to Austin?" Ramirez asked. "Soon. Got one more thing to finish first." That evening, Mills sat in his hotel room with his laptop open, writing his final case report. The document would be filed with the Texas Cold Case Review Project, archived in state records, and eventually made available to researchers studying unsolved crimes. But Mills always wrote them as if speaking directly to the victims, a habit that probably seemed sentimental to his colleagues but felt necessary to him. He typed slowly, choosing his words with care. Case 74. Rudson, Anna Marie Rudson. After 48 years, Anna Rudson has been found and brought home. Her remains were recovered from the Bosque River at a location described by her killer, Reverend Samuel Eugene Brooks, who has been convicted of her murder. This case represents both a failure and a redemption, a failure of the initial investigation that dismissed Anna as a runaway, and a redemption through modern forensic science and the refusal to let her be forgotten. Anna's mother, Martha Rudson, waited nearly 5 decades for answers. She maintained her daughter's innocence, kept a light burning, and never stopped believing the truth would surface. She passed away 3 days after learning her daughter had been found, finally able to rest. Justice in this case was delayed, but it was not denied. It simply waited, in a box in a basement, in DNA preserved on a handkerchief, in a river that held its secrets until someone was willing to listen. Mills paused, staring at the cursor. Then he typed one final line. Justice doesn't expire. It just waits to be heard. He saved the document, closed his laptop, and sat for a long moment in the quiet room. Tomorrow he'd drive back to Austin. Next week there'd be another case, another box, another voice waiting to be heard. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel what he rarely permitted during investigations. Not satisfaction exactly, but a profound, bone-deep relief that Anna Rudson's story had finally reached its ending. On the morning of Anna's reburial, the sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of rain. A small group gathered at the cemetery: Mills, Sheriff Ramirez, a handful of distant cousins Anna had never known, and a priest who'd volunteered to say a few words. Martha's grave was beside Anna's now, mother and daughter reunited at last. The casket was simple, white, and closed. Inside were the remains that had been subjected to every forensic test available, then finally released for burial. The priest spoke briefly about loss and redemption, about the long journey home. Mills barely heard him. He was staring at the headstone, thinking about the 20-year-old girl who'd bought a Coca-Cola and never made it to dinner. When the service ended and the others drifted away, Mills remained. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small evidence bag, the handkerchief embroidered with AR, returned to him after the trial concluded. He'd planned to place it in the case file archives, but standing there at the grave, it felt wrong to lock it away in storage again. He knelt and laid it gently on the fresh earth above Anna's casket. "You're home," he said quietly. "Both of you. Finally home." Then he stood and walked back to his truck, collar turned up against the wind. 60 miles away, in a maximum security medical facility, Samuel Brooks sat in a small room with barred windows, staring at nothing. He'd been placed in medical isolation due to his age and health conditions: diabetes, heart disease, the accumulated decay of 9 decades. Guards checked on him hourly. His meals were delivered on trays. He was allowed his Bible and nothing else. He didn't speak to the other inmates, didn't participate in recreation, spent most of his time reading scripture or gazing out the window at a small courtyard where nothing grew. 3 months after his conviction, on a cold February morning, a guard found him unresponsive in his bed. The medical examiner would later determine it was a heart attack, quick and final. Samuel Brooks died at 92, having served less than 4 months of his life sentence. There was no funeral, no service. His body was cremated, and his ashes placed in an unmarked container at the state facility. No one came to claim them. Years later, when people in Waco spoke of the case, they did so in hushed tones, still grappling with the cognitive dissonance of a trusted spiritual leader revealed as a killer. The story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil often wears a familiar face, that trust can be weaponized, that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those who claim to speak for God. But for Aaron Mills, driving past the Bosque River one autumn afternoon on his way to another case in another forgotten town, the story meant something different. He pulled over near the bridge where Anna's car had been found, the same bridge that had appeared in those faded Polaroids. He got out and walked to the railing, looking down at the water flowing quietly below. The river was unchanged, timeless, patient, indifferent to human suffering and human justice alike. It had carried Anna's secret for 48 years, holding it in mud and current and silence, but it had also preserved the truth. And when someone finally came looking, when someone finally cared enough to listen, the river had given up what it knew. Mills stood there for a long time, watching the water move beneath the bridge, thinking about all the voices still waiting in storage rooms and cold case files, all the daughters who hadn't come home, all the mothers still sitting by windows with lights burning against the dark. The work was never finished. There would always be more boxes, more forgotten names, more families waiting for answers that might never come. But sometimes, just sometimes, the waiting ended. Sometimes justice arrived late but arrived nonetheless. Sometimes the river remembered. Mills turned back toward his truck, the Bosque flowing on behind him, carrying the weight of memory and the promise of peace in its ancient, eternal current. And if you stood very still in the quiet of that November afternoon, you might have heard what the river had been whispering all along. The truth was always here. You just had to listen. The river kept her secret long enough. Now it carries her peace. The greatest lesson from Anna Rudson's story is that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It demands human persistence, even across half a century of silence. In America, where trust in institutions and religious leaders runs deep, we must learn to question rather than blindly accept. When Aaron Mills opened that dusty evidence box in 2022, he wasn't just seeking justice for one forgotten woman. He was exposing a systemic failure, the kind that exists in every society, whether in 1974 or today. This story also reminds us of the irreplaceable value of science and memory. DNA analysis, photograph enhancement, forensic technology. These aren't just investigative tools. They're proof of humanity's sacred duty to the past, our refusal to let the dead be erased by time or convenience. Across modern America, cold case review projects are growing. bringing forgotten voices back into the light. Each solved case is our collective promise. No one is truly forgotten. And truth, however delayed, always finds its way to the surface. If you believe that justice can be delayed but never truly lost, hit subscribe to stay with us as we reopen the cases time tried to bury. Thank you for following Anna Rudson's story. A daughter who waited 48 years to come home, and a mother who never stopped believing. See you in the next case, where another long-buried truth will finally rise from the shadows.